The Cave of the Patriarchs massacre, also known as the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre or Hebron massacre, was a shooting massacre carried out by American-Israeli Baruch Goldstein, also a member of the far-right Israeli Kach movement. On February 25, 1994, Goldstein opened fire on a large number of Palestinian Muslims who had gathered to pray inside the Ibrahimi Mosque, at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, West Bank. It took place on February 25, 1994, during the overlapping religious holidays of both Jewish Purim and Muslim Ramadan. The attack left 29 people dead and 125 wounded. Goldstein was only stopped after he was overpowered and beaten to death by survivors. The massacre immediately set off mass Palestinian protests and riots throughout the West Bank, and within 48 hours, 9 Palestinian protesters had been killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. Goldstein was widely denounced in Israel and by communities in the Jewish diaspora, with many attributing his act to insanity. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin condemned the attack, describing Goldstein as a degenerate murderer, a shame on Zionism and an embarrassment to Judaism. Some Jewish settlers in Hebron laud him as a hero and view his attack and subsequent death as an act of martyrdom. Background of Baruch Goldstein. In the 1970s, Baruch Goldstein, who was born and lived in Brooklyn, New York, was a charter member of the Jewish Defense League, a militant group deemed terrorist by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and an anti-Arab hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. After emigrating to Israel in 1983, he served as a physician in the Israeli Defense Force, first as a conscript, then in the reserve forces. Following the end of his active duty, Goldstein worked as a physician and lived in the Kiryat Arba settlement near Hebron, where he served as an emergency doctor. Israeli press reports stated that Goldstein refused to treat Arabs, even those serving in the IDF. This was also reflected in comments by his acquaintances. Goldstein became involved with Kach, and maintained a strong personal relationship with Rabbi Muklain, the militant Jewish nationalist whose views, regarded by the Israeli government as racist, had caused his party to be banned from the Knesset in 1988. Klein was assassinated in 1990 by Arab militant El Said Noza, and Goldstein reportedly swore to take revenge for the killing. Goldstein expressed anti-Arab feelings far before the massacre. He was known to refuse to treat Druze soldiers who served in the West Bank, believing it was against Jewish laws to treat non-Jews even for pay. In 1981, Goldstein wrote a letter, published in the New York Times, which said that Israel must act decisively to remove the Arab minority from within its borders, which could be accomplished by initially offering encouragement and incentives to Arabs to leave of their own accord. In October 1993, inside the Ibrahimi Mosque, acid was poured over the floor, leaving giant holes in the carpets, and 6 worshippers were assaulted. From the evidence of the sanctuary guards, Goldstein was identified as the culprit. A letter was written to Yitzhak Rabin, the then Israeli Prime Minister, by the Muslim authorities regarding the dangers of Goldstein and asking for action to be taken to prevent daily violations of the mosque. 4 years before the massacre, an agent of Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service, who had infiltrated Kach, passed a warning to his superiors about the danger posed by Goldstein. The agent ascribed to Goldstein the statement, "There will be a day when one Jew will take revenge on the Arabs." Massacre. The Israeli government divided the Cave of the Patriarchs into 2 sections, one for Jewish worshippers and the other for Muslim worshippers. At 5 a.m. on February 25, 800 Palestinian Muslims passed through the east gate of the cave to participate in Fajr, the first of the 5 daily Islamic prayers. The cave was under Israeli army guard, but of the 9 soldiers supposed to have been on duty, 4 were late turning up, and only 1 officer was there. Shortly afterwards, Goldstein entered the Isaac Hall of the cave. He was dressed in his army uniform and carried an IM Galil assault rifle and 4 magazines of ammunition, which held a total of 140 rounds in 35 rounds per each magazine. He was not stopped by the guards, who assumed that he was an officer entering the tomb to pray in an adjacent chamber reserved for Jews. Standing in front of the only exit from the cave and positioned to the rear of the Muslim worshippers, he opened fire, killing 29 people and wounding another 125. There were reports that he had thrown grenades at the worshippers. According to survivors, he bided his time until subdued, the prayer said while worshippers kneeled towards Mecca. After someone in the crowd held a fire extinguisher, which struck him on the head, he was overcome and then beaten to death. Reports after the massacre were often contradictory or ambiguous. There was initial uncertainty about whether Goldstein had acted alone. It was reported that eyewitnesses had seen another man, also dressed as a soldier, handing him ammunition. There were many testimonies that made mention of Israeli guards outside the cave having opened fire. Israeli military officials claim that no Israeli troops fired on the Palestinian worshippers. However, the New York Times interviewed over 40 different Palestinian eyewitnesses, many of whom were confined to hospital beds with gunshot wounds, and thus unable to compare notes. All witnesses corroborated that 3 Israeli guards opened fire, likely in panic amid the confusion, as the Muslims fled the shrine, with at least one soldier firing into the crowd. During the inquiry, an Israeli army official said 3 worshippers died in the stampede following the attack and 5 Palestinians were killed in street battles within Hebron later that day. Tikva Honig Parnas wrote that 10 Palestinians were killed and more than 100 injured by Israeli soldiers, who continued to shoot at those who were trying to flee the mosque, at those who were evacuating the wounded, and at people who had gathered at the hospital. She also reported that in the following 48 hours, 7 Palestinians were killed and more than 200 injured by soldiers at demonstrations. In the first 6 days following the massacres, 21 Palestinians were killed by live ammunition from the IDF. The testimony of various Israeli military officials was often contradictory. For instance, Danny Atom asserted that 2 of the guards had fired 6 or 7 shots in the confusion, but only in the air. While the 2 guards themselves, Sergeant Kobi Yosef and Sergeant Nivdrai, later testified to firing 4 shots chest-high. The guards' testimony was also at odds with the testimony of their ranking officer in claiming they had seen another Jewish settler enter the cave bearing arms. Casualties, list provided by the Palestine Human Rights Information Center. Response Israeli government The Kach movement, with which Goldstein was affiliated, was outlawed as a terrorist organization. The cabinet decided to confiscate the weapons of some they regarded as right-wing extremists and put them in administrative detention. The Israeli government also took extreme measures against Palestinians following the massacre, banning them from certain streets in Hebron, such as Al-Shuhada Street, where many Palestinians have homes and businesses, and opening them to the exclusive access of Jewish Israelis and foreign tourists. In an address to the Knesset, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin denounced Goldstein. Rabin, addressing not just Goldstein and his legacy but also other settlers he regarded as militant, declared, "You are not part of the community of Israel. You are not part of the National Democratic camp which we all belong to in this house, and many of the people despise you. You are not partners in the Zionist enterprise. You are a foreign implant. You are an errant weed. Sensible Judaism spits you out. You placed yourself outside the wall of Jewish law. We say to this horrible man and those like him, you are a shame on Zionism and an embarrassment to Judaism." Rabin, who regarded settlements as a cancer on Israeli society, considered that his failure to close down the Jewish settlements in Hebron after the massacre one of his greatest political mistakes. Benjamin Netanyahu, then head of the Likud party, declared, "This was a despicable crime. I express my unequivocal condemnation." Shamgar Commission, the Israeli government appointed a commission of inquiry headed by then-President of the Supreme Court, Judge Mu Shamgar. The commission in the epilogue to its report called the massacre a base and murderous act, in which innocent people bending in prayer to their maker were killed. Among its specific conclusions were, Goldstein acted alone in planning the massacre, telling no one of his scheme. Coordination between the IDF, the police, and the civil administration was problematic. The political leadership and security forces could not have been expected to predict the massacre. Testimony from survivors referring to IDF assistance and grenade explosions in the massacre was found to be contradictory and inconsistent. investigators did not find any grenade fragments. 3. There were, as claimed by some Jews seeking to justify Goldstein's actions as a preemptive strike, substantial warnings of a coming Hamas terror attack against Jews. It further stated. 8.2a. Warnings were issued regarding an expected attack by Hamas following the distribution of its leaflets in Hebron. 8.7a. Following an incident in Abu Dis, which ended in the deaths of a number of members of Al-Zaydin al-Qassam, of Hamas, emotions ran high among the Muslim worshippers, who shouted hostile slogans at the Jewish worshippers, making it necessary to call an army and border police forces. According to one of the Muslim witnesses, the Jews also shouted hostile slogans. 8.8 of those in charge of security at the tomb were given no intelligence reports that an attack by a Jew against Muslim worshippers could be expected, particularly since intelligence reports warned of the opposite, an attack by Hamas. Therefore, there was concern about an attack by Arabs against Jews. Critics of the commission have suggested that Shamgar's judicial record has consistently displayed his leniency toward the settlers, including those convicted of crimes against the Palestinians, but especially toward the soldiers who had fired at the Palestinians, and that his career reflected a history of pro-settler activism by promoting expropriation of Palestinian land to Jewish settlement that are against international law. Israeli public there was widespread condemnation of the massacre in Israel. A poll found that 78.8% of Israeli adults condemned the Hebron massacre while 3.6% praised Goldstein. The Jewish Settler Council declared that the act was not Jewish, not humane. Most religious leaders denounced the attack. The Sephardi chief rabbi said, "I am simply ashamed that a Jew carried out such a villainous and irresponsible act," and suggested that he be buried outside the cemetery. His Ashkenazi counterpart Israel Mullah called it a desecration of God's name. Rabbi Yehuda Amital of Gush Etzion said Goldstein had besmirched a Jewish nation and the Torah. Some rabbis reacted with ambivalence to the massacre, and a few praised Goldstein and called his undertaking an act of martyrdom. In eulogizing Goldstein, Rabbi Israel Ariel called him a holy martyr, and questioned the innocence of the victims by claiming they were responsible for the massacre of Hebron's Jews in 1929. Rabbi Dov Law of Kiryat Arba said he was a saint whose hands are innocent, his heart pure, and compared him to the martyrs of the Holocaust. At the time, settler Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg was the only prominent Orthodox rabbi who praised the massacre. He has since been detained several times for espousing extremist views. Veneration of Goldstein. In the weeks following the massacre, hundreds of Israelis traveled to Goldstein's grave to celebrate Goldstein's actions. Some Hasidim danced and sang around his grave. Although the government has said that those who celebrated the massacre represented only a tiny minority of Israelis, a New York Times report states that Israeli government claims may understate the phenomenon. In a pamphlet titled Baruch Goldstein published in 1994, and a book of the same name in 1995, various rabbis praised Goldstein's action as a preemptive strike in response to Hamas threats of a pogrom, and wrote that it is possible to view his act as following 5 halachic principles. The phenomenon of the adoration of Goldstein's tomb persisted for years, despite Israeli government efforts to crack down on those making pilgrimage to Goldstein's grave site. The grave's epitaph said that Goldstein gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah and land. In 1999, after the passing of Israeli legislation outlawing monuments to terrorists, the Israeli army acted to dismantle the shrine that had been built to Goldstein at the site of his interment. In the years after the dismantling of the shrine, radical Jewish settlers would celebrate Purim by invoking the memory of the massacre, sometimes even dressing up themselves or their children to look like Goldstein. Jewish diaspora. In the United Kingdom, Chief Rabbi Drive Jonathan Sachs stated, "Such an act is an obscenity and a travesty of Jewish values. That it should have been perpetrated against worshippers in a house of prayer at a holy time makes it a blasphemy as well. Violence is evil. Violence committed in the name of God is doubly evil. Violence against those engaged in worshipping God is unspeakably evil." An editorial in the Jewish Chronicle written by Chaim Berman denounced the Kach organization to which Goldstein belonged as neo-Nazis, and a U.S. creation, funded by American money and a product of American gun culture. The same edition also reported that some liberal synagogues in the UK had begun fundraising for Goldstein's victims. Palestinian public equals. Palestinian protesters took to the streets in the aftermath of the massacre. There were widespread protests and clashes in both the occupied territories and within Israel itself, in Nazareth and Jaffa. The Israeli army reported 5 Palestinians killed in clashes the same day within Hebron. Clashes in Hebron continued into May when 10 Palestinians were wounded by fire from settlers and Israeli soldiers. As a reaction to the trauma induced in children in Hebron, the Palestinian Child Art Center, a non-governmental, non-profit organization was founded. The activities of the center primarily involve the intellectual development of Palestinian children, and to reinforce a positive role for the child within Palestinian society and culture. 2 separate suicide bombings took place in March 1994, carried out by Palestinian militants inside Israel and launched by Hamas's Edin al-Qassam brigades, in retaliation for the massacre carried out by Goldstein. A total of 15 Israeli civilians were killed and 34 wounded in the attack, which took place in Afula on April 6, at the end of the 40-day mourning period for Goldstein's victims. Those were the first suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian fighters inside Israel. According to Matti Steinberg, who, at the time, was the Shin Bet head's advisor on Palestinian affairs, up until then Hamas had refused to attack civilian targets inside Israel, and the change in Hamas policy was a result of Goldstein's massacre. United Nations The United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 904 condemning the massacre and called for measures to protect Palestinian civilians including disarming Israeli settlers. Alternative names: the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre is also referred to as the Tomb of the Patriarchs massacre and the Hebron massacre, one of 2 events given that name, the other being the 1929 Hebron massacre. See also, List of massacres in the Palestinian territories, 1994 Brooklyn Bridge shooting, an act carried out in response to the massacre. Notes. References. Bibliography, Cohen, Aviad. Commitment and Complexity, Jewish Wisdom in an Age of Upheaval, selections from the writings of Rabbi Yehuda Amital. KTAV Publishing House. ISBN 1602800308. Inbari, Moti. Messianic Religious Zionism Confronts Israeli Territorial Compromises. Cambridge University Press. ISBN 9781107909127. Jacobson, David C. Israeli Poetry and the Bible. Wayne State University Press. ISBN 0814326234. Liechtenstein, Aharon. Law, Dov. A Rabbinic Exchange on Baruch Goldstein's Funeral. Tradition 28. Rabbinical Council of America pages 59-63. Lenan, David K. Enemy Combatants, Terrorism, and Armed Conflict Law, A Guide to the Issues. Praledger Security International Series. ABC Clio. ISBN 0275998142. Oliver, Anne-Marie. Steinberg, Paul F. The Road to Martyrs Square, A Journey into the World of the Suicide Bomber, A Journey into the World of the Suicide Bomber. Oxford University Press. ISBN 0198027567. Rayner, John D. A Jewish Understanding of the World. Burfan Books. ISBN 1571819746. Fitulo, Anita. The Massacre in Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi al-Sharif. Palestine Human Rights Information Center. Waxman, Chain 1 ETA Euro Unregistered Trademark as Not All Religious Fundamentalism. In Cohen, Richard I. Visualizing and Exhibiting Jewish Space and History. Studies in Contemporary Jewry. Oxford University Press. ISBN 0199934424-X.